Free Julian Assange.
Free Julian Assange.
Free Mumia Abu-jamal.
To demand that Julian Assange be set free, not be extradited to the United States. We find it outrageous that the United States government is talking about freedom, but they're jailing journalists like Julian Assange. They're jailing journalists like Mumia Abu-jamal. And this event today is an action taking place around the world to free Julian Assange. We have a great banner. There have been banner drops all over the country, all over the world, because we're going to make sure that he's not extradited. I think the war criminals in the United States should be extradited back to Iraq for the crimes that they did in Iraq. That would be a good start. Also going to be talking about journalists around the world who are also being repressed. Jang Jin-young. Jang Jin-young is a journalist in Korea who is facing prosecution because he did not register to cover the war in Ukraine. So they have the law. Korea has the only law in the world that you have to register if you're going to cover wars, and they'll decide what countries you have to register at. So in Korea, you have to register for covering the war in Yemen, the war in Iraq, and the war in Ukraine, and some other countries. Libya, you have to do that. So it's discriminatory and a very reactionary kind of law. It's an International Day of Action for Julian Assange. It's his birthday today. And we're demanding that he not be extradited, he immediately be freed. Julian Assange is a member of the, is a member of the Media Workers Union in Australia. He's a member of the International Federation of Journalists, and we're going to have a speaker here about that. Because the International Federation of Journalists has taken up the case of Julian Assange and also Mumia Abu-jamal to free them. We say, free Julian Assange! Free Julian Assange! Free Mumia now!
Free Mumia now!
Free Mumia now!
Free Mumia now!
And the U.S. government does not want information out about what's happening. That's why they're extraditing him. It's a warning to all journalists that if you tell the truth about what's going on in other countries, or if you publicize it, he was not there. He was given this information, so he himself did not do it. He's a journalist. He published, and he's being prosecuted under the Espionage Act. Now, isn't it interesting? An Australian citizen who has never been to the United States is prosecuted under the Espionage Act? What does that mean for people around the world? If you violate a U.S. law, you're going to be prosecuted under the Espionage Act, wherever you are. Well, there's no borders, apparently, for U.S. Law. Wherever you are, the U.S. will get you, especially if you expose U.S. war crimes, which Julian Assange did. And this is an issue of journalism. I mean, if they're successful in prosecuting and extraditing him and prosecuting him, the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Washington Post, all these publications could be prosecuted under the same law. So they have actually come out against the prosecution of Julian Assange. There needs to be an international campaign against his prosecution. There needs to be, and there is an international campaign to free him and also free Mumia Abu-jamal. So this is an important story that we're breaking through, and we're asking people who see the sign, which is a great sign, which was provided to us, actually speak out and demand. Now, there's a resolution that Tlaib has introduced in Congress to get the Attorney General to drop the charges, and we're supporting that as well. But Nancy Pelosi, Barbara Lee, who proclaims to be a liberal, is refusing to support Julian Assange. So where is Barbara Lee, who's running for Senate of the United States, and yet she's quiet about the prosecution of Julian Assange? I mean, that really is outrageous. Those people who call themselves liberal or progressive need to defend Julian Assange. So our first speaker at the rally today is going to be John Holmes. John is on the executive board of the Peralta Federation of Teachers, and he's speaking as an individual, but we're taking that up in the AFT. His union is affiliated with the AFT and other unions, so the unions, the labor movement, take a side. So welcome, John.
Thank you, Steve. I am speaking here as a labor representative for 4 years now. I've been a representative for adjunct instructors on the Executive Council of the Peralta Federation of Teachers. AFT number 1603. I have taught history at Merritt College, proud home of the Black Panther Party, but due to all the devastating cutbacks that have been going on, I am now a union rep for the part-timers, for the Freeway Flyers, but I don't even have a history class myself. Something that is happening to more and more instructors. In fact, I'm not even the only member of the executive council of our union who didn't have a job and so could not run for re-election this spring. You know, the coronavirus catastrophe was used as an excuse to downsize the community colleges by Gavin Newsom and all his clones and entourage running the state of California for the Democratic Party. The community college has been deliberately downsized by the Democratic Party in this ultra blue state. In the Bay Area, all over California, and for that matter, nationwide. Take a walk through Merritt College these days, or Laney College, and you feel like you're walking through a ghost town. That's what I got to say about that. I'm also a former printer, that's why I got this jacket, who was an activist for decades in the Bay Area Typographical Union, which merged with the Newspaper Guild to form the Pacific Media Workers Union. And as a retired member, was involved together with Steve in the fight to get the PMW to endorse Julian's defense case. I'm sure Steve will want to talk about that later. So we did manage to do that a couple of years ago. Now, in the future, I do hope to get my local down for Julian, for Freedom for Julian, but I regret to say that the Peralta Federation of Teachers shuts up shop for the summer. Not only do not have local meetings, we don't even have executive council meetings. And the summer school has been cut back so far that I heard recently that there were exactly 2 face-to-face English classes in the entire 4-college system this summer. 2 among all 4 colleges. That's part of the fact that one of the things they're doing now is getting rid of compensatory education for the poor people who are victims of the public schools and don't have good English and math. So in the past, the community colleges had classes for them, and just this year, that's been eliminated from the official mission statement for the community colleges, which tells you a lot about what Newsom and his clan want to do to the community colleges. But enough about that. Back to, now earlier this year, I should say, I did participate, our executive council did vote for freedom for Mumia Abu-jamal, which I participated in, of course, but this was never even publicized to the membership. It was simply a vote in the executive council. Passing resolutions is all very well, but unions need to mobilize their members to put their actions where their words are. Okay? Now, people here have talked about are going to be talking in detail about the persecution of Julian, so I don't need to do that. I do want to say that it is tragic that I guess me and Steve are the only labor representatives here.
No, that's not true. There are others.
There are others, good. I just, I look forward to hearing what they have to say. And that's any serious effort to protest against the misdeeds of the U.S. government here and abroad. Any fight to liberate immigrants from the hideous U.S. government concentration camps that Biden is maintaining and increasing. There are more immigrants in concentration camps now than there were under Trump. And the cages for children are still going strong, okay? Any defense of black people against police and racist violence needs union support. Any mobilization of working people against the steadily increasing impoverishment we are all being subjected to is unlikely to go far without the backing of the only organizations working people have to defend themselves against the crimes of our corrupt, imperialist, white racist, male chauvinist, and generally just plain vicious ruling class here in America, namely the labor unions. And what's the obstacle to doing that? It's the labor bureaucracies tied hand and fist to the Democratic Party, which among its many other crimes is trying to do in Julian Assange, among the many crimes of the Democratic Party. I won't give the whole list. I hope some of you know some of that list. Okay? There's a rumbling of revolt among American working people, but the labor bureaucrats are doing everything they can to keep it from getting out of hand and channel it into re-electing Joe Biden next year as if he were really any different from Donald Trump, except in the words that come out of his mouth. In practice, there is absolutely no difference between Biden and Trump from the standpoint of working people in America, except for verbiage. I say to hell with the Democratic Party. We need a working people's party, and not just something like the British Labour Party, that worthless affair, but a party to fight for fundamentally transforming a society in which every day the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and nothing really gets produced unless some capitalist makes a buck off of it. We need a Labour Party to fight for socialism. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, for many years, the attitude of the labor movement was not to touch the case of Julian Assange with a 10-foot pole. But that has changed somewhat, at least with the media workers' unions, like the Bay Area Media Workers Union, because the utterly phony rape accusations were dropped. Now that the bipartisan Democratic and Republican campaign to extradite him into American prisons is nakedly about preventing public revelation of the crimes of U.S. imperialism, the same liberal news media organizations who towed the line for the false sexual accusations against Assange, seeing that their asses, like Steve said, could be on the line next, are now willing to speak out for him a little bit, at least on paper, make the record without doing much about it. So the very last thing I want to say is that if we want to have a serious defense campaign for Julian, the lies about him cannot be ignored. They must be knocked down. For more than a decade ago, the true facts about the frame-up of Assange have been widely available for anyone who wants to see them. I don't have the time to go over just how crass the frame-up was, almost as crass as the frame-up of Mumia Abu-jamal, but anyone who wants to know the details, talk to me afterwards. I'll be glad to tell you in full. But if we are serious about freeing Assange, a legalistic free speech defense is not enough. We have to take on all the lies and slanders about Julian Assange front and center if we want to get real support for the fight to freedom. Thank you.
So we're here today on Julian's birthday in San Francisco in front of the Ferry Building to let people know that we have to free Julian Assange. Most people probably don't even know who Julian Assange is, but we have to free him, and we have to also free Mumia Abu-jamal and other journalists around the world who are being murdered, who are being jailed for telling the truth. You know, it seems to be that the penalty for telling the truth is the death penalty for a lot of these countries. They don't want journalists to tell the truth because they're covering up corruption, they're covering up war crimes. And the United States knows something about war crimes because we've invaded about 80 countries. We have 800 bases. And for example, in Peru, we just sent 900 troops to Peru to protect the military government there that overthrew the government. And people are not being told about that. And of course, our corporate media talks about democracy all the time, but they don't talk about the role of the United States in crushing democracy around the world. And that's exactly why Julian Assange was in prison, because he talked about, he helped publish the exposés in WikiLeaks about what the United States was doing in Iraq. So our next speaker is Ali. There's journalists around the world who are also being jailed and murdered, and Turkey has a long history of that. So welcome Ali to talk about what's going on for journalists and working people in Turkey. He's also going to be a member of UAW 2865, which before he gets up, I want to let people know, a week and a half ago, some UC graduate students, UC San Diego graduate students were chalking, like we're chalking right now. They were chalking at the university to protest the fact that the union is engaged in union busting. They're retaliating against union members because they went on strike and they signed a contract. So the police have charged 3 or 4 graduate students with felony charges for chalking. Now this is what's going on in this country. Can you imagine felony charges for union members for chalking? I mean, and the University of California is spending millions of dollars on lawyers, on union-busting law firms to go after students and workers. So welcome, Ali.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. As Steve said, I come from a country that has a long history of persecuting and murdering journalists whose job it is to reveal truths about the filth and dirt that's going on in day-to-day status quo politics. And when they do their job, like Steve said, they're penalized for that, and more often than not, that can be a death penalty. In fact, here we are talking about Julian Assange in the year 2023. This year is the 30th anniversary of the infamous Uğur Mumcu assassination back in Turkey. Uğur Mumcu was a journalist who was not a radical, who was not a socialist, who was not anything of that sort, but he was a truthful, honorable journalist who uncovered a lot of filth about government officials taking bribes and about the colonial war in Kurdistan. Now, and the beginning of the year, 1993, his car was blown up as he got on his car one morning, and as soon as he got the motor running, the car blew up. Now, who did that job? Who did that filthy work? Who was the assassin is still unknown for 30 years, 3 decades. Now, I come from a country like that, and the despotic regime in Turkey is still in the business of jailing, persecuting, prosecuting, incarcerating, oppressing responsible journalists, responsible media personnel, whose only job it is to reveal the truth about what is going on in the damn country and the damn world. And when they do their job, what do they face? They face charges for terrorism, and they're put in jail. There are thousands upon thousands of journalists who are right now in jail in Turkey. We have evolved. We have been more civilized, I guess. We don't at least blow up their cars, I guess. But the tyrannical regime is still in the business of oppressing and suppressing the truth. Now, the case of Julian Assange is very, very alarming. It should be alarming to working people and journalists and who are remotely, and anyone who's remotely interested in what is going on, the truth about what is going on in the world. Why? Because, like Steve said earlier, he only held up a mirror against the society, against the ruling class, against the ruling circles. And boy, they didn't like that. And even though he never set foot on the United States, he's being persecuted by the United States for committing espionage against the United States. The guy does not have any legal ties whatsoever to the United States. He merely revealed the information that was given to him. He did his job, that's all. It's like persecuting a bus driver for driving the bus to the final stop. But this just shows you how far the arms of oppression can reach around this world. And this is not just the case for the US or for Julian Assange. There are a lot of people around the world persecuted by France, Britain, what have you. Similar. And Turkey as well. So what I want to end my speech today is a simple slogan. Down with despotism, long live freedom. Down with despotism, long live freedom. Down with despotism, long live freedom.
The last rally that was held in San Francisco was around the issue of Julian Assange and Mumia Abu-jamal and it was held on World Press Freedom Day. Now, World Press Freedom Day is a day that journalists should be defended around the world because, as we've heard at this rally, there are many journalists around the world who are in prison. And we didn't know at the time, but there was also another action by the National Writers Union and the International Federation of Journalists to defend Julian Assange and Mumia Abu-jamal. And representing the National Writers Union and the International Federation of Journalists was the Edward Hasbrouck, who's with the National Writers Union, and he spoke at the United Nations. And they're participating in this action and supporting the fight to defend Julian Assange and Mumia Abu-jamal. Welcome, Edward.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks to all of you for coming out. And I want to say a few words first to those of you passing by who are wondering, what is this about and why should I care? For those of you who are Americans, whether you're from San Francisco or visiting from around the country, Julian Assange and Mumia Abu-jamal are being jailed and are being under threat of extradition in the case of Julian Assange, are being prosecuted in your name as Americans, and their prosecution is a threat to your freedom. For those of you who are visitors from around the world who've come here to San Francisco, welcome. But U.S. repression and the long arm of the U.S. assertion of long-arm jurisdiction is a threat to your freedom, too. My name's Edward Hasbrouck, as Steve said. I'm a member of the National Writers Union, which is an independent national union representing writers and digital media workers in every genre, medium, and business model. We are one of the U.S. affiliates of the International Federation of Journalists. And I bring you greetings today from Larry Goldbetter, president of the National Writers Union in New York. And from Brussels, I received the following statement this morning of solidarity from Dominique Pradalier, president of the International Federation of Journalists. For the past decade, the pursuit of Julian Assange has consumed me with fear, she writes, both for the WikiLeaks founder himself and for all the other journalists who would suffer were he convicted. Perhaps fresh legal instruments will present themselves to halt this process, but a much better solution would be for the U.S. government to realize the damage it is doing and to drop this prosecution. The impact of Assange being jailed in the U.S. would stifle the press at every latitude and at all points of the compass. His persecution has already made nervous those journalists who rely on classified material. Should his cell door clang shut for decades, any journalist handed sensitive documents would fret. Whatever the evidence of wrongdoing that had landed in their lap, is it worth the risk of publishing it? Assange's conviction would also endanger journalists whenever they travel to countries hostile to the U.S. Unsavory regimes will snatch and imprison reporters with impunity. When challenged, the despot's answer will be a shrug and a nod to the cell holding WikiLeaks founder. Perhaps Putin will never utter the words, "Hey, we all lock up the publishers of inconvenient truths," but that is what his smile will say. The case against Assange amounts to this. He sought out a confidential source who had significant evidence of what they considered to be criminal actions by the U.S. military, including shooting down civilians and journalists from a helicopter gunship. Assange is alleged to have coached this individual in discreetly removing this material and then passing it via WikiLeaks to publishers who would reveal serious criminal actions to the world. To me, it is obvious that these are actions routinely undertaken by investigative reporters. We would know much less about the war in Vietnam were it not for classified documents leaked by Daniel Ellsberg. Woodward and Bernstein's account of the Watergate break-in would have amounted to little without a confidential source. If the U.S. government does successfully prosecute an Australian who lives in the United Kingdom, then the punitive global reach of the U.S. Department of Justice will be cemented. Viewing this process from Europe, the case increasingly reminds me of a famous French injustice, that of Alfred Dreyfus. He was a French army officer wrongly convicted in an anti-Semitic conspiracy and imprisoned between 1894 and 1906. Today, no one doubts that Dreyfus was appallingly wronged by a reactionary establishment. At the turn of the 19th century, however, there was no more divisive issue in Europe. Scores of French institutions divided themselves into new organizations, split between the Dreyfusards and their opponents. Like many other victims of injustice, I'm certain that a time will come when the persecution of Assange will seem every bit as absurd as the case against Dreyfus or Nelson Mandela, or U.S. journalist Evan Gershkovich, currently wrongly being held in a Moscow jail. But that needn't happen, and I hope that it won't. But without a clamor that brings the U.S. government to its senses, we risk spending our next few decades wondering, why did we not speak up? Unless we find our voices to resist and raise our concerns wherever we can, a monstrous injustice to an individual is in process, as in a grievous blow to press freedom. On behalf of the 600,000 journalists around the world who are members of affiliates of the International Federation of Journalists I have the honor to represent, please do not let that happen. Signed, Dominique Pradalier, President, International Federation of Journalists. Let me say also, I was in, as Steve mentioned, I was in New York representing the NWU and IFJ inside the General Assembly chambers at UN headquarters in New York on World Press Freedom Day for an all-day symposium at which governments, good and bad, from around the world and NGOs and others spoke out, attempting to create a soothing sense of common cause by all the world's governments in support of press freedom. I was the one who was there to raise the discomforting fact for the U.S. representatives who wanted to talk about their support for press freedom elsewhere, that they are among the repressors of press freedom here at home. And I talked both about the case of Julian Assange, but also about Mumia Abu-jamal. And let me say a bit there about Mumia Abu-jamal. Mumia is an African-American radio journalist who has been imprisoned in Pennsylvania for more than 40 years on trumped-up charges, which were brought and trumped up as a retaliation for the effectiveness of his voice as a journalist on behalf of, in particular, African Americans in Philadelphia, victims of a racist fascist police force that terrorized their communities and whose voices had not previously been heard so widely or so effectively and so articulately as they were through Mumia. He was prosecuted, he was framed in an unsuccessful, I'm pleased to say, effort to silence his voice. Mumia is and has been for a long time a member of our union, the National Writers Union, holder of an International Federation of Journalists press pass. Earlier this year, our president, Larry Goldbetter, together with an international delegation from IFJ, visited Mumia in prison, and we're pleased to report that he's in better health than he had been at some points during the pandemic, and that he is carrying on with his journalistic work. One of the important things about the accusations made against both Julian Assange and Mumia Abu-jamal is the claim that these people aren't journalists. Well, the NWU is an extremely diverse union, the most diverse of American unions of writers and media workers, and I invite those of you here to join. Our effectiveness comes not because we have some highly paid staff, which we don't, but because by banding together, our members as volunteers are more effective in advocating for our collective interests than those of all writers and media workers. But the NWU's membership, critically in this respect, includes journalists. The NWU is the only organization in the U.S. accredited by IFJ to vet and approve the credentials and the qualifications of freelance and self-published independent journalists to hold an IFJ press pass. We know something about who is and who isn't a journalist, and we say that Mumia is a journalist. Not just was a journalist, because here too there are people who will say Mumia was a journalist. Mumia is a journalist, and this is critical for us, for our union, the NWU, and for IFJ, and it's been an increasing part of our work in recent years. Journalism about impacted and oppressed communities is not just about people from the global north going to the global south to report on what's happening there. The fastest growth in IFJ's global membership has been among its members and affiliates from the global south, reporting not only to their own comrades in their countries, but reporting to the world more effectively than people parachuting in from the north could about what's going on. And in the same vein, while Mumia has continued, thanks to really important work that people on the outside have done to help facilitate getting his voice out, he has continued to provide commentary on the events on the outside world. He has also been a key voice in journalism from within the prisons. And as long as mass incarceration persists in this country, there is a community of millions of people caged in this country who are able and need to be able and empowered and assisted to carry out their own journalism, to report to each other and to us on what's happening inside these cages. And that journalism from within the cages has been an important part of Mumia's work, as signified perhaps most clearly by the title of one of his collections of commentaries, which was published under the title of Live from Death Row. Mumia is still alive. He is alive and off of death row only because of decades of activism. If he is to be free before he dies, it depends on continued activism. We in the NWU, we in the IFJ, stand with our brother, our comrade, our fellow journalist, Mumia Abu-Jamal, as we stand with Julian Assange. Free Mumia, free Assange, free them all. Thank you.
I also want to report that the Pacific Media Workers Guild, which is a 1,000-member union of journalists, has voted to call for the freedom of Julian Assange and also Mumia Abu-Jamal. And we passed a resolution at our meeting in June, which is going to be going to the NewsGuild convention in St. Louis and also going to the CWA convention. And I have to say that our union, which represents the majority of journalists in the United States, New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, many other publications, needs to act because even, as I said earlier, the Washington Post and the New York Times have called for his freedom. So we're going to be taking this resolution, and we hope our union does the right thing and joins with the rest of the journalists around the world to free Julian Assange. We have to join with other journalists around the world to free Julian Assange and Mumia Abu-Jamal. So we're going to be bringing it up there, and hopefully it will be successful. So our next speaker is Brad Weidmeyer, who is a healthcare worker with the SEIU. The SEIU, by the way, 1021 has called for the freedom of Julian Assange, and other unions in the United States are supporting Julian. So welcome, Brad.
Free Julian Assange! There are demonstrations going on around the country. Just across the bay in Oakland, people are standing up and saying, this has to stop. This attack on our ability to have information that is important, that represents working people's interests. I'm from a local union of healthcare workers, and we are struggling and continuing the fight for health care for disabled and elderly. It's so important that we have access to the situations that we're facing. And one thing that we really need to do is to begin to take the steps to actively launch a workers' party in this country. And like others have said, not just like some of the weaker ones, but for our survival as working people. The environment is endangered. As a gay person, becoming a second-class citizen again is really shocking after 40 years. Since it feels a lot like the Anita Bryant craziness time again. And we have to form organizations that will fight for our political interests. And the labor unions must begin to also have committees to support a labor party. So we'll continue on in this effort, and You know, at one time in this city, the daily newspapers had labor columns when the Socialist Party was active and large, when the union movement was on the expansion. They had to report on what was happening in labor. And we need to do the work that will return us to that period when restaurant owners had to have representation of their employees so that people would actually attend them. And with the crisis of capitalism that's deepening every day, it's so important to get the facts and to not have our media sources menaced and assaulted as has done, the government has done for Julian Assange and Mumia Abu-jamal. Free Mumia Abu-jamal. Thank you.
Thank you. And one of the things about, thank you. And one of the things about capitalism and what's going on with the media is thousands and thousands of journalists have been fired, have been laid off. And you have hedge companies taking over newspapers and basically they only want to make money by speculating on the properties. That's what's going on to journalism, because for capitalism, journalism has to make a profit. And they use, in the media companies, the tech companies like Apple and like Google, they use news stories, but they're not paying the journalists for those stories. They're making money off those stories, but they won't pay the journalists. And there's a bill in the state legislature to require them to compensate them. And you would think that the journalists, the media companies are terrified of that bill. We're going to actually have to pay for journalists. They want something for free. They want slave labor. They want gig labor. There's another issue that we're talking about is AI, because war and AI are together. They want to have military robots, they want to have war machines, and they're spending a lot of money for AI to develop the war machine around the world. In San Francisco, people are sleeping on the streets, they can't get health care, they can't get housing, and we spent $150 billion on Ukraine. We have trillions of dollars we're spending on war. But they can't take care of the people in this country. That's something journalists are writing about, and that's why they don't want independent journalists to write about those stories, because those stories are about really the crimes of capitalism. And the imprisonment of Mumia Abu-jamal, the imprisonment of Julian Assange is a crime against people. That's a criminal crime, as are war crimes. They silence these journalists because they're telling the truth. And that's what we're trying to break through here, the information blockade by the corporate media. The reason people don't know about Julian is they don't want people to know about Julian. Why is an Australian in prison in England for violating the espionage laws in the United States? Why is that? Because they want to silence him, and they want to tell any journalist, if you tell the truth or if you allow the publication of what's true about U.S. imperialism, you're going to end up in prison, you're going to end up dead. And that is a great danger to people in this country and around the world. Journalists are being killed, journalists are being imprisoned, and we have to defend them on a global level. So our next speaker is Toby, and she's an activist with Code Pink, and actually she said that the sign was so beautiful she wanted to use it in other events. So welcome, Toby.
If they're not standing up for the attack on free press, and especially someone like Julian Assange, who took so much risk to expose all the crimes of the U.S. government globally and nationally. So I think about Julian a lot, and I think it's important to have these rallies, but I think we have to do a whole lot more, and we have to make sacrifices to get changes in this country. And one of the things that I think about a lot is the civil rights movement and why there was such success during that era. We still have racism in the country, but we don't have Jim Crow laws. And when I think about the major actions that people took during that era, and especially the Montgomery bus boycott that lasted for over a year, and the freedom riders who rode on the buses in spite of knowing that they were going to be brutally attacked, and they persisted, the buses kept coming, And it was that commitment, that willing to take risk and take sacrifice that allowed for change to happen in this country. And I was thinking today about Julian. I was thinking, how are we all going to feel if the day comes when Julian dies in prison? How are we going to feel about that? I'm not going to feel very good. And I know that I could do a lot more. And I would like those who are willing to do a lot more to come together and organize and discuss what we can do. For example, if we all sacrificed one day a month, and I'm talking about a long, sustained effort, not something that you come and do for a day and it's over, you go home and you go ahead and have your life. That you stay committed to something for a year or 2 years, whatever it takes to get Julian out of prison and Mumia Abu-jamal, and bring Edward Snowden home, and get Daniel Hale, the drone whistleblower who's serving almost 4 years of his young life in prison, his young, valuable life. And all those, the main prison, political prisoners, we should find a sustained action that we can do and be creative, make it enjoyable, but really be committed. Come out for a day every month or a day every week, whatever you're able to. I know there's people that work, there's limited, but there's weekends. You know, everybody can sacrifice one weekend a month. And if we organize and think about it and use the intelligence that we have and the creativity that we can have, we can make an impact. But we have to do it so we're putting a thorn in the side of the people that have power. That's what we have to do. We have to be angelic troublemakers, which is the term I got from Bayard Rustin, right? I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right. He was a man I just recently learned about. What an inspiring man. He was sitting on buses refusing to get off before Rosa Parks, way before in the 40s. And so we have to be a thorn in the side of people that have power. So if anybody is inspired by the message I have today, please come up to me and tell me you're willing to commit at least one day of your life a month. And let's start having meetings about where we put the power. Do we have an ongoing encampment in front of Pelosi's house? I'm willing there to be there for a couple weeks and keep it going, having everybody come out for one day a month until Julian and Mumia and Daniel Hale and Edward Snowden can come home, can be free.
We're going to close out by a song, and Brother John Holmes from the Faculty Union at Peralta Federation of Teachers has agreed to sing it.
Arise, ye prisoners of salvation, arise, ye wretched of the earth, for justice thunders condemnation. A better world's in birth. No more traditions change shall bind us. Arise, ye slaves, no more enthralled. The earth shall rise on new foundations. We have been naught, we shall be all. 'Tis the final conflict. Let each stand in his place. The Workers' International shall free the human race.